Good evening, everybody. My name is Jay Pugliese. I'm going to give my little bit of an introduction as we go forward. But tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what to do if you're ever involved in an officer-involved shooting or serious use of force incident. And what we mean by a serious use of force incident is obviously a shooting or any use of force that either leads to serious injury or death or any in custody deaths. They're all handled basically the same. So we're going to use the words officer-involved shooting tonight, but we can apply all of these principles to any of those events. With me tonight is attorney Eric Brown. Eric, do you want to just give your quick introduction?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. So hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Eric Brown. I'm with the law office of Eric Brown and Nutmeg Independent Unions. So Jay Pugliese is certified by the Force Science Institute, and we decided it was important for us as leaders of Nutmeg and with multiple police unions to just give you an opportunity to hear from Jay about what needs to get done if you're ever involved in a use of force incident. So Jay has a lot of information to share with you, and we're excited to do that tonight. I'm going to try to stay in the background and let Jay take over. But of course, if you ever have any questions or concerns about any of this stuff, you can reach us, go through our website at thelaborlawyer.com or nutmeglaborunions.com. So Jay, take it away.
All right, thanks, Eric. All right, so tonight we're gonna talk a little bit about what happens immediately after the shooting. We're gonna talk about securing the scene, giving a public safety statement, which is something that a lot of police officers are either unfamiliar with or are almost afraid to give. The old adage has always been that if you are involved in a serious use of force incident or a shooting, you are considered a homicide suspect. I don't agree with that at all. I think you are a survivor. You're certainly not a criminal. You've just survived an attack. And part of the investigation is making sure that the victims are treated, any witnesses are identified, and the suspects are apprehended. So that's what the public safety statement is. And we're going to go into a little bit more about what that means and what it entails. We're also going to talk about evidence collection, everything from your firearm, which is obvious, to more traditional forensic evidence, like what might be found on your uniform. What's very important is collecting the body cam footage. And when I say collecting the body cam footage, that doesn't mean just drop your body camera into the dock that automatically uploads those images and those videos to the web, to the cloud, or whatever kind of server you use. You need to retain the actual raw video. We're going to talk about why that's important. We're also going to talk about leaving the scene. Again, the old way of doing things was the officer has to immediately go to the hospital. And that might be true. That might be the correct course of action in most of the situations, but sometimes it's not. We're going to talk about the differences and when it's appropriate and when it might not be. And we're going to talk about administrative leave. That's usually going to something that's going to happen immediately afterwards, and it's not a punishment. And we're going to talk about why it's almost important and why it's helpful to the officer. After that, I want to get into briefly a little bit about the types of investigations that you're going to face, writing your report, which is a very important piece, but we're just going to briefly touch on that. I think we're going to cover that in more detail in the second half of this webinar series, which is probably going to come out after the first of the year. And we're going to talk about interviews. The last topic I want to touch on quickly is just the long-term effects of being involved in a traumatic incident. And what you can do to help keep yourself well. Again, that's going to be something that we're going to go into a little bit more in depth on in the second half of this, but we are just going to touch on it tonight so you have an idea of where we're going. All right, just to give you a quick little bio about myself. My name is Jay Pugliese. My full name is Ronald. I just go by Jay. I've been a police officer for the last 20 years. I retired in July of 2020. I spent most of my time in the Detective Bureau doing investigations. A lot of it was digital forensics and computer crimes investigations, financial crimes and arson investigations. While I was a police officer, I went to law school, got involved with our union, And my original plan was to be a prosecutor, but things change. And I did an internship with Eric, and as I finished up my law degree and retired from the police department, Eric was expanding his law firm and Nutmeg Independent Unions, and brought me on full time. So happy to be here, and happy to be able to represent labor unions, police unions, and police officers in general. That's really where my passion still lies and what I still really enjoy doing. All right, so tonight I just want to start with a quick video. It's not very long. It is a local video, so some of you might recognize it. This is a shooting from Ansonia that occurred last year, early last year. I'm just showing a very small part of it, and just to kind of set the stage and give you an idea of how quickly these things can unfold.
Yeah, we're good. Next one. Open up the doors. You'll have a chance for that. Right there. 5-5 shots fired. Hands on your back. Hands on your back.
6-8-39.
Okay, as you can see, these situations unfold very rapidly. I think those guys did everything they could. They tried using a lesser amount of force, but as you see, he came out of the room with a very large knife and, basically charged at the police officers. It kind of really didn't leave them with any choice. But now they've got to live with that, the fact that that happened, and now deal with the immediate after effects. So some of the things that officers are responsible for immediately after an officer involved shooting or after any serious use of force or in custody death are laid out here in the slide. They're not really in any particular order, and it's not a full list. A lot of these are going to be case dependent, and you might take a few of these off or add to this list depending on the situation. But one of the primary things that you need to do is identify any remaining suspects and take any necessary action. If it's still an ongoing situation, obviously you have to keep yourself safe and keep the public safe and move on to the next suspect. Secure and separate the suspects that you have either are injured or deceased or down or are in custody. Notify dispatch of the incident. Relay as much information as you can to dispatch, including fleeing suspects, their description, their direction of travel, request a supervisor and any additional resources, holster and secure any weapons involved. Now, again, if this is an ongoing situation and you still think there's more threats out there, just like you're trained in firearms, do your scans, make sure the scene is safe before obviously putting your weapon away. Render any medical care to yourself or to other officers, suspects, or witnesses as needed. Call for EMS as needed. If you have a few minutes, try to do a quick survey of the scene and identify and secure any evidence. Also, you're going to be looking around for potential witnesses, other suspects, suspect vehicles, and if you can notice it quickly, and if it comes to your mind at the time, try to note any surveillance cameras in the area so that you can notify the investigators so they can get as much video evidence as possible. And unless the officers are injured and they need to be transported immediately, they really should stay on the scene until at least the supervisor arrives or backup unit arrives so that they can maintain the custody of any evidence that's there, maintain the integrity of the scene, and pass on any pertinent information that might be helpful to tracking down any other suspects that are still at large. Once the supervisor arrives on scene, the first thing that they're going to be doing is making sure that the scene is safe and making sure that all the injuries, including the officers, are attended to. Once that's done and the scene is essentially secured, what they're going to do is ask for a public safety statement. A public safety statement is not an incriminating statement. It is not something that violates your Fifth Amendment rights or your Garrity rights or your Weingarten rights. As we all know from the academy, one of the exceptions to the Miranda rule, or to the Garrity rule in this case, even your Fifth Amendment rights in general, is public safety. And we remember the story of the suspect fleeing, the armed suspect fleeing through a grocery store and throws the gun into a vat of oranges, I think it was. And when the officers take him into custody and ask him where the gun is, he tells them, they go in, seize the weapon. That statement was usable in court because the reason for it wasn't to incriminate the suspect or gather evidence, although that was the secondary result. The reason for asking those questions was to make sure that that gun was found so that a child or somebody else didn't pick it up and either hurt themselves or someone else with it. So that kind of all falls into the same category here. The public safety statements really has three purposes. You need to identify additional threats. So if there's other armed suspects out there or other safety concerns out there, those need to be addressed as soon as possible. You're going to determine the physical conditions of the officers, the suspects, and any third parties. You're really looking for injuries, and you want to make sure that anybody that is injured, whether they're a suspect, a bystander, or one of the officers, is immediately treated. And you want to identify any other concerns to public safety, whether there are, live weapons laid out on the ground or armed suspects fleeing at a high rate of speed. And in today's climate, we know how dangerous that can be in itself. Just at the beginning of November, a Naugatuck police officer was struck and severely injured by a vehicle fleeing a shoplifting. Turns out he had some other reasons for that possibly, but nothing worth running down a police officer for. So we really need to make sure that all the information possible is out there to other responding officers so that they can stay safe and take any suspects into custody safely without getting injured themselves. A public safety statement should be taken from every officer that's involved in the incident. Anybody that fired their weapon or anybody that might have immediately been involved in the incident itself should have a public safety statement taken from them. Mainly because everybody has a slightly different perspective and may have seen different things or may have seen things differently. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that might be as we go on this webinar tonight. All right, so some of the information that you're going to be asked to provide in a public safety statement is very simple. We're not looking for detail. We're not looking for you to remember and recall facts or detailed facts. It's very simple information that you should be able to recall even after a traumatic incident. And if you can't recall it, there's no harm in saying, I just don't remember. And in fact, I'd rather you say, I don't remember than try to guess at some of these. But the first thing you're going to be asked for is what type of force did you use? Now, if we're talking about officer involved shootings, obviously that's an easy one. The force is going to be a firearm. But as we said before, this also applies to other serious uses of force. So if it's a taser death or some other type of death or serious injury caused by either a blunt object or something like that. The direction fired by the officers and the suspects. So we want to know what direction you fired and what direction the officers fired, the suspect fired back in. And the reason for that is it helps us determine where evidence might be. It also helps determine where other injured persons might be, someone that may not have been found yet, if a bullet penetrated a wall or into an apartment or something like that. So we really do need to follow that up as well and make sure that there aren't any injuries out there that we don't know about. We need to know how many suspects are involved, especially if some of them are still out and at large. If it's a one suspect and that one suspect is down on the ground, that's important information to know. So now we're not putting out all this information out over the radio and looking for suspects that may not potentially exist. Again, we need to know the location of injured persons. If you know where someone is that's injured, that needs to be pointed out immediately so that the proper medical care can be dispatched over to them. And you need to give a description of what those at-large suspects look like, how long they've been gone for, the mode of travel, direction of travel, and very importantly, if they're armed or potentially armed and what type of weapon they might be armed with. Again, that goes back to officer safety and getting that information out to other officers that are going to be helping to contain these suspects. We also need to know a description and location of any known victims or witnesses. So maybe they're not so much an injured from the shooting, but if they were the victim of the initial crime and can provide some background information on the suspects and a better description and more information on what types of weapons they're armed with. Victims and other witnesses are very important, and they're important to identify immediately so that they can at least be identified and their information taken so that they can be interviewed later. We're going to need a description and location of any known evidence, whether that's firearms, whether that's shell casings, blood evidence, whatever it might be. Maintaining that scene and collecting the evidence properly is very important. Like we said before, we're not going to be treating the officers as homicide suspects, but the scene itself is still a crime scene. And it's a crime scene not because the officer fired, but because the suspects brought that on themselves. They essentially, attacked and assaulted an officer, so that there's the crime scene there as well. And we also need to know any other information necessary to ensure officer and public safety. So, description of vehicles, any if you have an idea of where they might be fleeing to, anything that might help apprehend any suspects that are still out there. All right, to get into evidence a little bit, one of the first and probably, I don't want to say the most important piece of evidence, but one of the more important pieces of evidence would be the officer's firearm. And if it's not the firearm, it would be whatever other weapon was used, whether it was a taser death or something like that. So the actual object. After the shooting, try to holster and secure your firearm. If you can avoid it, try not to manipulate the gun. Don't unload it. Don't reload it. Obviously, if it's an ongoing situation and you think there's still a threat and you're down ammo, then doing a tactical reload or putting the gun in an operable position. Obviously, you should be doing that. I'm talking about after the situation. If it's safe to do so and there's no additional threats, try to keep the firearm in the same condition that it was when it was fired. And when you turn that firearm over to the supervisor, you want to turn it over in the same condition that it was in. Now, I know that sometimes seems counterintuitive to a lot of officers. They always want to unload the weapon first, and there has to be a lot of communication here to make sure that this is done safely. Also have to follow some local protocols and make sure that everybody's on the same page. I mean, you may have a policy that says you can never hand a loaded weapon to another officer. And if that's the case, then, I would suggest following the policy. But the idea here is that for the investigators to see your weapon in the condition that it was in when the incident happened, because they're going to want to check things like functionality. They're also going to want to count the rounds. So, I think this is a good time to mention, before your shift starts, you should always make sure that your spare magazines and your weapon are topped off. If you had to respond to a call the other day to put down a rabid raccoon, and it took 3 rounds, make sure you replace those rounds. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to explain why you say you fired 2 rounds and there's 5 missing. just make sure that you know, your gun is fully topped off and all your magazines are topped off and it's ready to go. Once you turn your weapon over to the supervisor or the investigator, who, you know, however that's going to happen, if possible, the supervisors should be replacing that officer's weapon. This was a very stressful situation. The officer may not feel safe still, if they're still there on scene, they may not feel safe without a weapon. So they really should be given a replacement weapon, or if possible, the supervisor can take the officer's weapon and give the officer his or her weapon to carry in the meantime until they're removed from the scene and brought to a safe location. Some of the other evidence that's going to be important is, just like any other shooting investigation, is going to be the officer's clothing and their uniform, their duty gear, their boots. And there's probably, that's all going to have to be seized at some point for, you know, a multitude of forensic testing. Before the officer's clothing is taken, please make sure that they have something appropriate to change into. Don't put them in a prisoner suit or one of the paper suits that you have in your cell block. Don't run out to Walmart and buy them the, you know, cheapest 1980s pair of sweatpants and old man sneakers. And don't try to just dig through a donation box or, you know, whatever you can find in everybody's lockers. Send someone to the officer's house. Make sure that they can, you know, have appropriate and comfortable clothing that they can wear and they're comfortable wearing, you know, whether they go to the hospital or whether they come back to the station. But you know, they are going to be in a very stressed mood, and having something comfortable and appropriate to change into might just help make them feel a little bit better. And certainly you don't want to make them feel any more like a criminal. The whole idea here is to avoid treating them like a suspect. And certainly putting them in a prisoner outfit or a paper suit that you would put someone that's, you know, suicidal in your cell block, that's just going to make the officer feel terrible. So do your best to get them something comfortable and appropriate to wear. We mentioned earlier the body camera. What you want to do here is secure the actual physical device, the part of the body camera that actually retains the data. Sometimes it might be the battery pack. Sometimes it might be the camera itself if they're separate. I know some of the newer ones are all enclosed in one unit. But what you want to do is take that camera and secure it, and have somebody that's trained in video forensics and digital forensics actually secure that. And if you can, have your training officers or supervisors or whoever manages the body camera program contact the vendor and find out what the best way to retain the actual device is without losing any data. What you don't want to do is plug it into the dock and upload those files to the cloud storage device or to your own in-house storage, because what that does is compress the videos and creates, you know, AVI files and other types of video files, and you lose a lot of data when you compress. And things that don't, the way the algorithms work is some of the areas of the video that don't have a lot of change might get skipped over, and you might lose something that happens. So you might lose something that happens very quickly, like the sound of a firearm discharging, the muzzle flash. You might lose some information in the background, and other parts of it might get pixelated and might get clouded out. So when you actually go back and view this video, or it's used in evidence, if you say you fired 4 rounds and the audio track is not lined up, and it either only shows 2, or if it's not lined up correctly, or there's more than 1, you may have 4 or 5 in there, or 6, and they may differ from video to video because of that compression algorithm. So getting that raw video is very, very important. And there are some great programs out there that can get into some more detail on that. You can even find some videos on the web on how compression works and how it can distort a video, and that distortion can really come back to bite you in the ensuing investigation or in court later on. So make sure that video is handled properly. And that the same rules should apply to any in-car video or any private surveillance. If there's a convenience store or a fast food restaurant or something like that in the area that has surveillance cameras, have somebody that's trained in recovering that video properly go and get that video. You don't want to just throw it on a thumb drive and take it in the easiest format to view, because that's going to come with the same problems with the compression, with the changing of the video. You may not have that option with cell phone videos. They get compressed sort of just by the way they're created on the phone. They're not as the quality isn't as good in some phones. But it's still important evidence, and if you can get that, then go ahead. But just remember, if you can control this at all, make sure you get the actual raw video without any compression, even if it requires an additional player to play. Lean on your video forensics people, your computer forensics people. Lean on them to retain and process that video properly, so all of that evidence and all of that information is retained. All right, some of the other forensic tests that might be conducted, as with any shooting investigation or any serious use of force investigation or any serious assault investigation. You're going to be looking at gunshot wounds. You may be asked for a drug and alcohol screening, depending on your policies. You may be asked for swabbings of blood if you have some of the suspect's blood on you or your clothing or your equipment. And you may be asked for a DNA sample to match up to evidence that might be found on the suspect or other areas of the crime scene to kind of help piece the whole thing together. Before submitting to any more invasive testing, consult with your union or your legal representatives first, and just make sure that you have, you get some advice on how that can be conducted. Obviously, if the investigators choose to get a search warrant, you're not going to have a whole lot of options. And you may also be compelled by your administration to submit to these tests. But talk to your union lawyer, talk to your criminal defense lawyer before doing that, and just make sure that all of your options are at least discussed and explored before submitting to these tests. After the shooting, like we said before, the old way was, no matter what, the officer should always go to the hospital. And I agree with that 90% of the time, to be honest with you. That probably is the best place for the officer to go, even if they say they're not injured. There's still a few things that you'd want to. You want the officer to be checked out to make sure, because they may not know that they're injured. You're going to want to have their vital signs assessed, and that can help later on with documenting the stress that the officer is under or was under during the situation. If they do go to the hospital, try to make sure they go to a different hospital than the suspect. And if the officer doesn't want to go to the hospital, it's really up to them. Don't push it. If they're clearly not injured, and they'd rather go back to the police station, they'd rather go home, or they'd rather go to some other safe place, even if it's a cabin in the woods or something, it doesn't really matter, as long as they're with somebody and they feel safe. If you are going to transport them to the hospital, an ambulance is probably the best bet. But a lot of officers may not want to ride in an ambulance, depending on the circumstances. And if that's the case, again, don't force it. Allow them to, if they do want to go to the hospital but not in an ambulance, take them in a police car. If you can use an unmarked car, that would be great. If it has to be a marked car, move your stuff off the front seat and let them sit up front. Do not put them in a cage. Do not put them in a closed-in rear seat of a police car. that's only going to make them feel more like a suspect. And again, I know I keep harping on this, but they are not suspects. They are not homicide suspects. They're not murderers. They are survivors. They just survived a very traumatic incident and survived an attack that very well could have taken their own lives. So treat them as such. And at the very, very earliest possible moment, allow them to call their family and let them know that they're okay, and to explain the situation. The last thing I think my wife ever would have wanted to hear was that I was involved in something serious on the news or on social media or something like that. It's much better for the officer to call home and explain what happened, let them know that they're okay, let them know what they need. This would be a good time to ask their wife or family members to put a change of clothes together that somebody can come and pick up, and let them know where the officer is going, whether they're going to the hospital or whether they're going to the police station, so that someone from the family can come down and be with them. I think out of all of this, aside from treating injuries, that's probably one of the more important tasks to handle here, is make sure that they have an opportunity to call home and talk to their family as soon as possible. It'll also help relieve some of their stress and maybe calm them down a little bit, so they're not so worked up. All right, we said we already talked about the ambulance. It's the best choice, but if they don't want to go in the ambulance, that's fine. Take them in a police car, use an unmarked car. Just at the very least, do not let them drive from the scene. A lot of times they may not be able to take their own car from the scene because it might be, obviously part of the scene and become evidence. But you have to remember, they were just involved in a very, very stressful situation. So allowing them to drive from the scene is probably not the best option. Give them a ride, but again, put them in the front seat of an unmarked car if that's possible. And one thing that the supervisor should be doing is assigning a companion officer. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why this companion officer should not be talking to the officer about the situation. But the idea of the companion officer is just to keep the officer involved, keep them informed, and let them know that the suspects were caught. Let them know that the scene is ongoing, or they've got these other victims, or this was the overall the crime. Keep them informed, and just have somebody there to be with the officer. It makes them feel more safe. It makes them feel secure. It brings down the stress levels a little bit, and they really should not be left alone. And it also gives them somebody to talk to. But as I said before, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, the companion officer and the officer involved in the shooting should not be talking about the incident itself. And there's a very good reason for that, and we're going to get to that. But it has to do with legal privileges and what that companion officer can be later made to compelled to be to talk to, or talk about, or testify. So that should be the one subject that is off limits between the two officers. They can talk about anything else. They could talk about sports. They could talk about the early parts of the shift, talk about the party they went to last week, but just keep the details of the incident off the table for the time being. Once this is all said and done, usually it'll probably happen after the officer is released from the hospital and is brought back to the station later on. They'll be placed on administrative leave. This is not a punishment. This is actually good for the officer. It's standard practice. It really helps the officer to kind of cope what happened. It takes them out of the fray a little bit. It gives them some time to recover mentally and physically. It gives the officer's brain some time to sort of reorganize, flush all those stress hormones out, and reset. It also gives the officer some time to go out and seek some mental health treatment, which we'll talk about as well. And I think that is really, really important. And it's really been underrated over the years. And officers are almost afraid to go seek treatment after one of these things, but I think that's a big mistake. I think that's a very important part of your own well-being and your own recovery after this. And it also gives, obviously, the officer some time to go and meet with their union lawyer, meet with their criminal defense lawyer, and any other representatives that they need to prepare for the upcoming investigation. That's what we're going to kind of move on to next. We're going to talk a little bit about what the different types of investigations that you can expect are and how they sort of play out. So generally, after an officer-involved shooting, you can really expect two separate and distinct types of investigations. There'll be the administrative investigation, which is also referred to as the IA, if that's what you want to call it. And that's really to determine whether the force that you used was reasonable and within policy. And if it's not, then what discipline should be issued. And that's usually done either by the internal affairs. If it's a larger department, they have their own internal affairs division. They may farm that out to another department who has an internal affairs division and officers trained in doing internal affairs investigations. They may farm it out to the state police. I don't particularly like that idea because state police are also, at least right now, are going to be doing the criminal investigation as well. And I don't think that those two investigations should be mixed at all, but sometimes that's a little bit outside of our control. We can do what we can to keep those separated, but we may not always have a lot of power to do that. But we'll do our best to make sure that it's not the same investigators and interviews are not done at the same time. You might also be looking, especially with the new police accountability bill here in Connecticut, you might be looking at a post or your certifying body investigation. Excessive use of force now is a reason for decertification. We really haven't seen how this is going to play out yet, but at some point it's probably going to happen. So that would be another place where you would need representation. And if the department, state police, or a neighboring department doesn't have a proper internal affairs department to do this, your agency might farm this out and hire an outside law firm to come in. The Daigle Law Group, for example, tends to come in sometimes and do some of these internal affairs investigations on behalf of the town. It's handled the same way, and the rules are all the same. It's just now there's an impartial body coming in from the outside to look at the policies and to look at the situation and see if there were any violations. During the administrative investigation, you're going to be represented by your union. Particularly, it should be a union lawyer. And we're going to talk a little bit about privilege as we go on, but you don't want to talk to anybody but your union lawyer. When you start talking to your local presidents or to a rep or somebody like a business rep or someone that's not a lawyer that's coming in to represent you, there's some legal questions there that we'll get to. The other investigation that you might potentially be looking at is a criminal investigation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get charged, but a criminal investigation is usually done alongside the administrative investigation just to determine if the use of force was lawful. And those are usually done by the state's attorney's office or district attorneys, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. Here in Connecticut, obviously, it's state's attorneys. There was just a new position created here, again, with the police accountability bill. The inspector general's office, they're going to be taking over the duties of investigating police use of force cases and prosecuting anybody that's found to be unlawful. State police, county sheriff's offices, depending on your jurisdiction. Here in Connecticut, the state police generally are the investigative body, and they work closely with the state's attorney's office and turn all of that information over. And depending on the situation, depending on the area that you're in, you could potentially face an FBI or Department of Justice investigation, especially if you're in a department that's already under investigation by the Justice Department or in a department that's under a consent decree. And for these investigations, for the criminal aspect of it, you really should have a criminal defense attorney with you to help you navigate this part of it. All right, so as we said before, you're really going to want, for the administrative investigation, you're really going to want a union lawyer. You want an attorney that's versed in labor and employment investigations, workplace investigations, and public sector employment. If you're here in Connecticut and you're a unionized police officer, your union will be able to provide that for you. Like if you're one of our members with Nutmeg, that's all you get is lawyers. We don't have business reps. You're never gonna have to deal with a business rep. You're always gonna get a lawyer, and for the most part, we'll be at your PD or at the hospital or wherever you need us, even that cabin in the woods, within an hour of the shooting. I mentioned it before. I just want to get in a little bit more in depth here. If you are with one of the bigger unions, with FOP or AFSCME or one of the other unions that provides reps, they're probably going to be the first ones that reach out to you, because they usually will. They might have lawyers on staff, or they might have them on retainer, but getting them out in the middle of the night might not be possible, or that might not just be the way that they work. So you might end up with the rep. I want you to be very careful about talking to union reps, business reps, or even your local union officer, particularly your local union officers, your president, your steward, or your vice president. There's not a very strong privilege there. There's a little bit of a privilege that's been recognized by the courts when talking about grievances, but when you talk to your union president or you talk to your business rep, and this isn't in the grievance process yet. So you really don't have a very strong privilege there, and they could ultimately be compelled either by subpoena or by order of the administration to tell you what conversations you had. I would hope that they would file some challenges to that, but you never know, particularly with the officers, other officers, local, like your local union president, other officers in the same agency may be ordered by the administration to talk. So you don't have that privilege at all. The attorney-client privilege, on the other hand, is a very strong privilege, and it's against the law, it's against public policy for anybody to try to compel myself or Attorney Brown to talk about your conversations. So any conversation that you have with me or any other lawyer is strictly confidential. You can talk about anything you want. You can cry, you can voice your frustration, whatever you need to get through is 100% confidential and can never be made public. So there is a very big distinction between a union rep, a local union officer, and your union lawyer. Really try to make sure that you're speaking to a lawyer. On the criminal side, you're going to want a criminal defense lawyer, and you want someone that's experienced in police use of force cases. You might also be involved in a civil investigation later on if a lawsuit is filed, and if you feel that you need some personal representation on that, you're going to want someone that, again, is experienced in defending police officers in civil cases. And here at Nutmeg, if you have any questions or any needs for somebody outside of the union, we have a very wide network of other lawyers that we work with, that we trust, and we can recommend and set you up with anybody else that you need. Even if you're injured in the incident, you need a workers' comp lawyer, for instance, we can take care of all of that with just a phone call. So here, the big question that goes back and forth, and I've heard a lot of different opinions on this, is when do you watch your body cam footage? Do you watch it before you write your report? Do you watch it after you write your report? Do you watch it ever at all? And there are different opinions out there on this. I can tell you my personal opinion is I do not want you watching your body cam footage before you write your report or before you give your interview. And the reason for that is that the legal standard that you're going to be judged by is not what's on the camera. It's not what can be looked at 24, 48, 3 weeks after the incident. It's your perception of the events right then and there at the time the force was used. So sometimes watching the body camera might actually change your perception and change what you remember. And what's important is what you remember at that point. So again, there's different opinions out there. There's other lawyers that may say, no, we want you to watch the body cam first and put in all the possible details. But that's easily explainable. If there is a difference between what you write initially and what's on the body cam footage, that's something that we can explain, and we can bring in expert witnesses to talk about how your memory works and how your body reacts under stress. So that's pretty easily handled. What's really the most important is to make sure that you get not as much minute detail as possible, but you want to know why. We want to explain why you took the actions that you did. And the reason why you took those actions is going to come from your perception at the time the force was used, as opposed to what might be shown on the video. So I personally believe that you should not watch your videos before sitting down and discussing it with your lawyer. But if your lawyer has it, if it's a different lawyer than myself or Attorney Brown, then talk to them, get their opinion, and really make your decision there. There are pros and cons to both, but again, trust your lawyer and go from there. All right, so the next thing that we want to do, and I put this here, the next slide is going to be talking about interviews. I put this here because I don't want, I want you to write something. I want you to write out your statement first. And I want you to write out your statement with your lawyer first before you give an interview. But before anybody talks to you, this really shouldn't be done for 48 to 72 hours. You really need to get a couple of good sleep cycles in. You need to have a chance for your brain to heal. You need to have a chance for your brain to sort of go through and flush out again all those stress hormones and sort of reset. You'll be able to recall details better, and you'll be able to move through the whole scene with a little bit less emotion. Work with your lawyers to draft a statement. So what I like to do, and it's worked it's worked so far for me, is I like to take and write out the officer's statement with them. Sit them down, go through it from top to bottom. And we're going to make this as detailed as possible. One thing that we're going to harp on is I don't want you to just write in your report, I was in fear for my life. If you want to use those words, that's fine, but you really have to explain why. And you have to explain why here, now, at the early stages. Kind of the old way of doing things was just to leave it at that. I shot because I was in fear for my life. And then the rest of it would be dealt with later on in interviews, even at trial. And I think that's a really bad idea. Police officers, unfortunately, don't have the same level of respect that they used to. So trying to convince a jury that all these important facts that you're talking about on the stand 2 years later are important and relevant, but we're not in the initial report, is really difficult. And the jury's sometimes just not going to believe you. And that's a problem. So we need to get as much detail now as possible. And I know that might seem like a little bit of a change from the old way of doing things, but with the current climate, we have to get as much information out there as soon as possible. And what I like to do is draft the whole report before the interview. And then we take that report, we take that statement, and we copy and paste that into the police report. We copy and paste it into a memo for an IA investigation. And when it comes time to do an interview, rather than sit down for hours of questioning, you just hand them the statement. They read it over. If there's any follow-up questions that they have, we answer them. And then again, that gets copied and pasted right into a statement form as part of either the administrative or even the criminal investigation. And when you're done with all this, keep a copy of it, because you may have to get deposed 2 years, 3 years, 4 years later. And you really want to make sure that you have that handy and you know it. And so there's no details are missed. Again, for the interview, it's going to be at least 48 to 72 hours later. After that, a couple of sleep cycles to clear out all those stress hormones and let your brain have a chance to heal and reset. If you're going to be compelled to speak during the administrative investigation, they're going to give you, you're going to be read your Garrity Rights, which are very similar in a sense to the Fifth Amendment Miranda rights. It's based on the same right against self-incrimination. It just means if you read your Garrity Rights, it means that you are being compelled to speak, you're being compelled to tell the truth, but anything that you say cannot be used against you in court. On the other hand, if it's a criminal investigation, you do have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So you, as we all know, you don't have to speak to the criminal investigators. And that's why we want to keep those investigations separate. Don't ever allow the administrative investigator and the criminal investigator to sit in the same room and do one interview. It may seem like more efficient, it may seem like it's saving time, and they may try to bill it as, we don't want to put you through this twice. We don't want to have you relive this incident more than once. But the interviews are done for two very separate reasons, and you have different rights during those two interviews, and they really need to stay separate. So talk to your lawyers, make sure that those stay separate. Don't let that happen. I think that's a really important point to kind of hit home about, and make sure that you keep them as separate as possible. And again, when you walk in, sit down, hand them that report that we've already written. Let the investigators go through it. If they have any follow-up questions, we'll answer the follow-up questions and keep it within the four corners of that statement that we just wrote. And that's why it's important for you to understand it and know it, so that you can answer those follow-up questions. But from there, for the most part, we show up with it on a computer, so we can make any changes that we need to, put it on a thumb drive, give it to the IA investigator, the state trooper, whoever's handling the interview, and they copy and paste it right into their own statement form. It gets printed out and we sign it. And that's it. The interviews generally take less than an hour doing it this way. And it saves a lot of time. And now everything is done consistently. So everybody's on the same page. All the documents match up, the interview matches up, and everything is nice and neat. All right. So last thing I kind of want to talk a little bit about here is mental health treatment at EAP. Now, we're going to go much more into this in the second half of this webinar, which we're going to do after the first of the year. I'm guessing probably around February, we'll roll that out. But I think it's a really important aspect of an officer-involved shooting or any type of serious traumatic event that you've been involved in as a police officer. PTSI is post-traumatic stress injury. The vernacular is changing a little bit. They're not experts aren't considering this so much as a disorder, but more as an injury. And it's an injury just like any other physical injury is, and it needs to be treated. It needs to be treated properly. Requires medical treatment. You're not gonna try to just walk off a broken leg, because obviously it needs to get set. You need surgery, you might need medication, and it needs to be treated properly. Same thing is holds true for PTSD or PTSI. It is an injury to the brain. It needs to be treated medically. There's absolutely no stigma to getting medical treatment, to getting mental health treatment. In fact, it's something that really should be done on a more regular basis for police officers, especially officers that work things like special victims or sex crimes or child pornography. Those incidents in itself can cause PTSD or PTSI, and sometimes it really helps just to go in and talk to somebody about it. Again, there's no stigma. It doesn't mean that you're crazy. It doesn't mean that you're unfit for duty. It just means you have some extra baggage there that you just need to work through. And there are people that are very good at treating police officers. They understand the process. They understand how a police officer's brain works and understand what the stress of the job does to their brain, and understand how to treat it. So you really want to find somebody that is experienced in treating police officers and dealing with police officers. EAP is a good place to start. And remember, this is all confidential. The doctor-patient privilege is just as strong as that attorney-client privilege. So anything that you say with very few exceptions, in these situations is protected. If you go in and you talk about your officer involved shooting and you work through some of the stresses, when you walk out the door, that therapist can't pick up the phone and call your chief and say, "Oh, this guy's crazy." The only time that they can breach that privilege is if they think you are a danger to yourself or a danger to other people. And that's the same standard everywhere, with all of these privileges. So it's a safe place to go, and a safe place to go and talk about your feelings and talk about the incident, talk about that stress, and really get some advice on how to and some proper medical treatment. It really is important to get that treated properly. So a couple things here, just as we wrap this up tonight. We're just about at the hour mark. Anybody that's involved in an officer involved shooting is not a criminal. You're not a homicide suspect. You're not a murderer. You are a survivor, and you should be treated as such. Supervisors, fellow officers really should be taking this to the extreme. You are a survivor and should be treated as a survivor and a hero for working through that situation and surviving that situation. Another thing, every agency should have an officer involved shooting policy in place. What happens after a shooting, especially in the smaller agencies where these things really don't happen all that often. They happen once every 10 years or longer. This needs to be spelled out. It needs to be put on paper, and everybody needs to be trained in this so that there's no missteps, that everything is done properly. And it's very beneficial for the agency and for the officer and for the municipality to have these done properly and to have all of the legal counsel in place beforehand and get everybody on the same page and set and ready to go. Because if the officer stays out of trouble, the town stays out of trouble, the agency stays out of trouble. It really is beneficial for everybody. So have a policy and train on that policy regularly. Keep the officer that's involved informed as much as possible. Again, you want to be careful about having that officer talk about details back to anybody else, but there's no harm in keeping that officer up to date. What's going on? Was the suspect caught? Was the suspect arraigned? Was the suspect, treated at the hospital? Are they being held on bond? All these things are important for the officer to know, especially if this was a multifaceted situation and they were on one end of it, and another incident happened across town or something like that, then really keep the officer involved and give them as much information as you can possibly relay to them. It just helps them feel like they're still part of the team, helps them realize that they're not forgotten, and they may be able to add to that information and provide some other details that might help either catch the suspect or prosecute the suspect. Again, peers should stay in touch with the officers. Don't just send them home on administrative leave and let them sit on his couch and play video games all day. Reach out, take them out to lunch. He or she out to lunch. Make sure they're doing okay. Make sure they're getting any support that they need. Again, though, just be careful about talking about the details. And one thing that I can, if there's any advice I can give here, it would be to have legal representation in place in advance before something like this happens. Talk to your unions. If you're one of our members with Nutmeg, like I said, we've got a lot of this groundwork already laid. So if you call us in the middle of the night and say, we just had an officer involved shooting, we need help, Attorney Brown and I will be there. We're going to handle all of the administrative stuff. We have very close relationships with other lawyers that handle the criminal side of it, a lawyer that can handle the civil side of it if needed, and a lawyer that can handle the workers' compensation side of it if needed. So we can really check all of those boxes, and all you have to do is just make one phone call. But if you're not with Nutmeg, if you're with one of the other unions that don't have these services in place, try to get them in place early on. Reach out to some other lawyers and build a relationship with them, because you really do need to have somebody that you can call in the middle of the night and get somebody there within an hour, so that the officers involved can have all the support that they need. And the last thing, it's really important, I think, to sign up for one of these legal defense funds, like a PORAC or FOP's got a legal defense fund. They're not very expensive. The networks are pretty broad, so you can usually get some of the top billed lawyers for nothing, as long as you're part of these defense funds. And if you need some more information on that, reach out to us. We can certainly provide some contact and give you some more details on that. We actually advocate signing up for some of these things in when we do contract negotiations. We try to get the towns to pay for them. Some of them do, some of them don't. But it's usually a proposal that we make and try to get it paid for. And if not, if the union wants to pay for it as a whole, it's really not that much money. All right, so like I said before, this is going to be a two-part webinar. The next part of the webinar, we're going to talk a lot about report writing. I really want to harp on putting the why in there. Again, I don't want to just see, I fired because I was afraid for my life. You really need to explain why. And you need to explain in detail, as much as you can remember, what the suspect was doing and why you felt you were in fear for your life. Because you may not get another opportunity to get that out and get that out effectively later on in the process. And we're also going to talk a lot about the physical and mental effects on the officers. How to the PTSD, PTSI, recovering from stress. Do want to talk a little bit about peer support and how that interacts with other mental health treatments, EAP, and other professional treatments, and a little bit about a fit for duty exam and when that might come into play and how that would work. But again, that should come out probably early 2022. I think we're shooting for around the beginning of February to get that out. So if you registered for this webinar, you will get an invite to the second half. And just like with this one, by all means, feel free to share that with your departments and any of your friends. The more people we get to register for these, and the more officers that we can get this important information to, and the more officers we can help, is really what our goal is here. So if anybody has any questions on anything that we talked about today, here's all my contact information. my email address is rjp@thelaborlawyer.com. And you can visit us on the web at thelaborlawyer.com or Nutmeg Labor Unions. We also have another website called joinnutmeg.com if you're looking to switch from whatever union you're with and come on board with us at Nutmeg. With that, that's about all I have for tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Attorney Brown to offer his closing remarks. Thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Great job. We're always here to help. We represent a number of police unions in the state, but we're really here to serve police officers in Connecticut. So if anything occurs where you feel like you might need assistance from us, even if you're not part of our union, we're always here to help. You guys come and gals come first for us. And if you need our assistance, we're happy to take care of you. So thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Stay safe out there.